At age 81, Tom Selleck is still remembered as one of the most enduring and reliable icons of American television, a man who has spent more than half a century building a career that few can match. From his iconic role in Magnum P.I., where he not only won an Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor, but also became the face for an entire generation of television fans, to his role as Frank Reagan in Blue Bloods that has lasted more than a decade, helping him continue to maintain a solid position in the hearts of the public while many stars of his era have stepped away from the spotlight. He also left his mark through a series of successful feature films, such as Three Men and a Baby, the movie that was the highest-grossing film of 1987 in North America, along with his memorable appearance in Friends, which brought him another Emmy nomination and affection from a new generation of viewers. He was awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, honored by television and film associations, and is seen as a prime example of an actor who can maintain his form, reputation, and respect in an ever-changing industry. A career that is measured not only by awards, but also by stability, reliability, and influence that has lasted through many decades. But behind those achievements is a journey that was never easy, where every step forward came with increasing pressure, where he had to constantly work on grueling schedules to maintain his position, where his body gradually accumulated invisible pains, from joint problems and back issues to the prolonged fatigue that age brings, the sleepless nights when work and responsibilities piled up, the mornings when he had to stand in front of the camera with a smile that audiences expected, even though inside he no longer had the energy like before. He did not allow himself to stop, did not allow himself to appear weak in front of the public, because he understood that the image he had built was not just his own, but also the expectation of millions of people who had trusted and followed him for many years. And precisely in that silence, in continuing to move forward even though his body and spirit were tired, his will became clearer than ever. Not the will to become famous, but the will to continue standing strong, to continue finishing what he had started, no matter the price he had to pay. Before moving on to the next part, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to follow together the journey of a man who has dedicated his entire life to maintaining the image that the world trusts. That is not just an act of support, but also an appreciation for the will that has helped him continue to stand firm, even after going through so many difficult years. Born in Detroit in 1945, Tom Selleck did not enter life with any signs that he would become an icon that millions would later admire. With no family spotlight, no artistic background, no early praise from those around him, only a quiet and ordinary childhood that was easy to forget, and when his family moved to California to seek better opportunities, the boy had to start over once again in a new environment, where everything was unfamiliar and the competition was much more intense, where other children seemed to always have something more standout, quicker, more confident, while he just stood there, not prominent enough to be noticed, not special enough to be remembered. And that feeling, the feeling of not being good enough, not fast enough, not talented enough, gradually took root deep in his mind in a way that even he himself did not realize. During his school years, he was not an outstanding student, nor the most prominent athlete. Even though he had good height and physique, he still always felt he had to try twice as hard just to achieve what others seemed to achieve naturally. And every time he was not chosen, every time he was overlooked, every time he had to stand and watch others move forward, it was another time he learned to silently accept. But it was also another time the will inside him was formed, not noisy, not strong immediately, but quietly, persistently, like something that refused to disappear. His family was not wealthy, but they had something else, something that later became the foundation for his entire life, that was discipline and responsibility. His father was a strict man, not easily satisfied, always demanding real effort, while his mother was the one who kept the family stable, creating an environment where each member had to take responsibility for their own life. And precisely in that environment, Tom Selleck learned that no one owed him success. No one would give him opportunities just because he wanted them. All he could do was keep trying, keep moving forward, even when no one was watching. There were days he wondered if he was going in the right direction or not, if his efforts meant anything or not, when the results still did not change. But he did not stop, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he did not know any other way except to continue. And precisely that unconditional persistence became the biggest difference between him and those who had given up. When he entered adulthood, he still carried the feeling that he had to prove something, not to the world, but to himself, that he could become someone he had never been seen as, that he could overcome the limits that life had set for him from very early on. And even though the road ahead was still unclear, even though he still did not have any standout talent or a clear opportunity, he still continued to move forward, because deep inside, he understood that sometimes the only thing a person can do is not stop, even when everything around seems unchanged. And precisely in those years that no one remembered, a will had been formed, a will that was not noisy but strong enough to keep him standing firm against everything that was still waiting ahead. In the years that followed, when Tom Selleck began to step into the acting path, he did not enter the spotlight with a big opportunity or a destined role, but with a long series of failed auditions, cold waiting rooms where he sat among dozens, even hundreds of other people, all carrying the same hope, but only a few were chosen, and most, including him, just quietly stood up and left without anyone remembering. There were auditions that lasted only a few minutes, where he tried his best to perform, to prove that he deserved a chance, but the gentle shakes of the head from the producers extinguished everything, with no clear explanation, just the familiar feeling that he was once again not good enough. Those years had no stability, no steady income, and to survive, he was forced to take on many different jobs, from small advertisements to nameless roles, even jobs unrelated to acting just to pay the rent and continue to hold on in California, where his dream seemed increasingly distant. He once appeared in television commercials that no one remembered, once stood in the background in scenes that audiences did not notice at all, once took roles where the character's name was not even recorded, and each time like that, he wondered whether he was moving forward or just standing still in a loop with no way out. The entertainment industry at that time did not lack strict standards, and Tom Selleck was often judged as not suitable, not because he did not try hard, but because he did not match what they were looking for. His face was seen as too rigid, his style was considered too classic, and in an era that was changing rapidly, he seemed to belong to no trend, not prominent enough to be the first choice, but also not different enough to create his own path. The rejections did not come from just one place, but from all sides. From directors, producers, to major film studios. All looked at him and reached the same conclusion, that he was not the person they needed, and that, repeated over many years, began to create a psychological pressure that he had to carry every day. He watched others, those who once stood with him in the waiting rooms, gradually get opportunities, get roles, get recognition, and move forward step by step, while he remained still continuing to audition, still continuing to hope for something that had never happened. There were moments when he stood outside the set, looking inside, where the lights were shining, where other actors were working, and wondered if he would ever really step inside, or if he would always be the one standing outside, looking into a world he had spent too much time pursuing. The pressure came not only from failure, but also from time. As each year passed, opportunities seemed fewer, as age began to become a factor that this industry could not ignore, and as those around him began to have more stable paths, while he was still there, still continuing to chase a dream that showed no sign of becoming reality. But what made him different was not that he did not feel tired or doubtful, but that he did not stop, even when all signs suggested he should. He continued to show up for auditions, continued to take small roles, continued to work to maintain his life, Not because he was sure that success would come, but because he could not accept giving up when he had not yet truly known how far he could go. Each time he was rejected, he came back. Each time he was not chosen, he looked for another opportunity, and even though opportunities became fewer, even though the distance between him and success seemed not to narrow, he still continued to move forward, because, for him, stopping was not an option. In those years that no one remembered, when his name had never appeared on any headline, when there were no awards, no recognition, only quiet persistence, Tom Selleck had built for himself something that no one could see at that moment, a will that did not depend on results, a resilience that was not broken by failure, and precisely that, even though it did not bring immediate success, was the only thing that kept him standing firm in a journey where most people had given up long before, after all those rejections, when most people in that situation had chosen to stop. Tom Selleck entered another even more difficult stage, a stage that was no longer sudden shocks, but the prolongation of an unchanged state, where every effort seemed to bring no clear results, where each passing day was the same. Still the auditions, still the small jobs, still the feeling of trying but not moving forward. And precisely that repetition was the biggest challenge, because it did not make him collapse immediately, but made him gradually tired over time. In that situation, he had no other choice but to continue learning, to continue honing his acting skills, not because someone required it, but because he understood that if an opportunity appeared, no matter how small, he had to be ready, and to do that, he had to become better every day. Even when no one was watching, he joined acting classes, studied how other actors portrayed characters, observed how they moved, how they spoke, how they created emotions. And gradually, he began to build for himself a foundation that he had not had before, not a natural talent, but a skill trained over time, through persistence and through failures. Throughout that time, he accepted small roles, roles that many others might refuse, not because they brought fame or money, but because they gave him the chance to work, to stand in front of the camera, to continue existing in the industry he had spent so many years pursuing. There were roles that appeared for only a few minutes, characters with no depth, scenes where audiences might not even notice his presence. But he still did them, still prepared, still focused, because for him, every opportunity, no matter how small, had value. There were no big breakthroughs, no sudden changes, only slow accumulation, bit by bit, as if he was building something whose shape no one had seen yet. Meanwhile, the entertainment industry continued to change. New faces appeared, new trends formed, and the pressure to adapt became clearer than ever. But instead of trying to become a different version of himself, he chose a harder path, which was to keep what he believed was right, to keep his own style, even if that meant he would not fit with most of what was happening around him. He did not chase trends, did not try to change himself to fit the changing standards, because he understood that if he did so, he might get opportunities faster, but he would lose the only thing that made him different. And in an industry where everyone tried to be the same, keeping his own identity, even if it did not bring immediate success, was the most important thing. Those years passed in silence, with no recognition, no clear rewards, only one single belief that kept him going, the belief that persistence would eventually bring an opportunity, that if he continued long enough, if he did not give up, there would be a moment when everything he had accumulated would make sense. But that belief was not always easy to hold. There were days he doubted himself, doubted the path he had chosen, doubted whether all these efforts would lead to anything. But he still continued, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he could not go back, could not quit after everything he had been through. In a world where results are often measured by speed and fame, his journey seemed to go against all of that. Slower, harder, and less noticed, but precisely that trained him with a resilience that not everyone has, an ability to continue even without rewards, an ability to stand firm even when no one was cheering. And when looking back, precisely those unchanged years, precisely that persistence in silence had created the foundation for everything that came after. Because when the real opportunity appeared, he was no longer just someone looking for a chance, but someone who had been ready for it long before. After many years of holding on in silence, when even Tom Selleck himself was no longer sure whether the path he chose would lead anywhere, the opportunity he had been waiting for finally appeared, not loudly, not with advance notice, but enough to change his entire life. That was when he was cast in the lead role in Magnum P.I., a decision that at the time not everyone believed in, because he was not a big name, not a safe choice, and after so many years without clear progress, he was still just an actor that most audiences had never known. But precisely that persistence, stretched over a decade, had prepared him for that moment. A moment that, if it had come earlier, he might not have been ready enough. But when it arrived, he did not miss it. When the series began airing, everything changed at a speed that even he could not have predicted. From someone almost unknown, he became a face appearing every week on the screens of millions of American families. The image of a man with a calm, strong, and reliable demeanor quickly became an icon, and the name Tom Selleck was no longer a distant name, but a part of popular culture, something he had spent many years approaching but had never truly touched. That success did not come easily, and did not come with relief, because when fame arrived, it brought with it a volume of work he had never experienced before. Filming schedules that stretched from early morning until late at night, days of continuous work with no real time to rest, trips, interviews, demands from producers, and the pressure to maintain his performance in every episode, every scene. Because at this point, he no longer represented only himself, but also a show, a crew, and the expectations of millions of viewers watching him every week. There were days he stepped onto the set when his body was already tired, when sleep was not enough, but he still had to maintain the image of a character who never collapsed, a man who always controlled every situation. And precisely that contrast between what audiences saw and what he experienced began to become a familiar part of his life. The awards and recognition he received afterward were not only the result of the role, but also acknowledgement for all the years he had not given up. The Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor was not just a title, but proof that his quiet efforts had finally been seen, that the previous rejections were not the end, but only part of a much longer journey. And when standing on stage to receive the award, perhaps he was not only thinking about the current success, but also about all the times he had left the audition room with a feeling of failure, all the days he wondered whether he should continue or not, and all the moments when he had chosen to stay even though there was no clear reason to do so. But success also brought another challenge, a challenge that was not easy to recognize right from the start. That was the pressure to maintain the image that audiences had become familiar with. When a role becomes too big, too popular, it not only shapes how others see you, but also creates a mold that you must continue to fill. And for Tom Selleck, that meant he had to continue being the man everyone expected, even when that no longer fully reflected his true self. The praises, the recognitions, the admiring looks all came with an implicit demand that he must not change, must not weaken, must not step away from the image he had built. And that, over time, became a significant pressure, a pressure he had to carry every day, in every role, every public appearance. From someone who once had to struggle to be noticed, he became someone who could not escape attention. From someone who once searched for opportunities, he became someone who had to choose between opportunities. And that change, although it brought the success he had pursued for many years, also carried a feeling of loss. Because the path to that position was not only progress, but also trade-offs. Trade-offs of time, energy, and a part of the freedom he once had. However, what made this journey different was not just that he achieved success, but the way he continued to move forward after achieving it, not letting fame completely change who he was, not letting pressure make him stop, but continuing to work, continuing to contribute in the same way he had done throughout the years before, only this time the whole world was watching. And precisely in that moment, when he stood at the peak of his career, when his name had been recognized, when everything seemed to have become clear, a new chapter began. No longer the journey of searching for opportunities, but the journey of maintaining what he had achieved. A journey no less difficult, where every step carried a much greater responsibility than before. Success from Magnum P.I. did not bring Tom Selleck the rest he had once imagined during those struggling years before. But on the contrary, it opened a new and even harsher phase, where each day no longer belonged to him. The work schedule was so packed that there was almost no space. Filming sessions stretched from early morning until late at night, scenes repeated over and over until they met the requirements. Continuous trips for promotion, interviews, public appearances, all happening at a speed that the human body and mind could hardly keep up with. And in that cycle, the concept of rest gradually became a luxury. As the show became more successful, media attention also increased exponentially. Every action, every word, every expression of his was monitored, analyzed, and judged, and that created an invisible but far from light pressure, forcing him to maintain the image of a perfect man, strong, calm in every situation, with no room for mistakes, no space for fatigue, because any sign of weakness could shake the image he had spent many years building. There were days he walked out of the set with his body exhausted, but he still had to continue appearing in front of the camera during interviews, still had to smile, still had to answer questions that he had sometimes heard hundreds of times, and in those moments, the boundary between his true self and the public image gradually became blurred, because he no longer had much time to return to being himself. Balancing work and personal life became a challenge he had to face every day, when work demanded almost all of his time and energy, while his private life needed presence, care, and patience, things he could not always provide, and precisely that shortage gradually created gaps that he could not easily fill. Responsibility to the film crew and to the audience was also a factor that kept him from stopping, because he understood that the success of the show did not depend on him alone, but was the result of the joint efforts of many people, and his continued work was not just for himself, but also for all those who placed their trust in him, from his colleagues on set to the millions of viewers waiting for each new episode. And precisely that sense of responsibility made him continue to move forward, even when his body had begun to send warning signals. Small pains appeared more and more frequently. Signs of fatigue no longer disappeared after a night's rest, and although they were not yet big enough to force him to stop, they were still reminders that the human body has limits, that no one can maintain that intensity of work forever without paying a price. But instead of slowing down, he continued, not because he did not recognize what was happening, but because he was not ready to stop, not ready to give up the position he had spent too many years achieving. And in an industry where replacement happens quickly, stopping sometimes meant being forgotten, something he had experienced before and did not want to repeat. Therefore, he continued to step onto the set every day, continued to perform his role with the focus and professionalism that audiences expected, continued to appear in public with the familiar image, even though inside small cracks had begun to appear that no one could see. In those years, his will was no longer something that helped him overcome failure like before, but became something that helped him maintain success, helped him continue to stand firm in a position that not everyone could hold. And even though that required him to sacrifice more, to endure more, he still accepted it, because he understood that the path he had chosen was never an easy one. And if he had come this far, then he would continue, step by step, no matter how much more his body and spirit had to endure. In the nonstop cycle of work, when every day of Tom Selleck was filled with scenes, meetings, and endless demands, His marriage to Jacqueline Ray gradually entered a challenge that neither of them could have predicted, not because they did not try, but because the time they had for each other became less and less to the point where it was almost gone. The evenings that used to be quiet moments to share became empty spaces filled with fatigue. The rare days off were dominated by unfinished work, and in a relationship, presence was not just being in the same place, but truly being there in each other's lives, something he found increasingly difficult to maintain as the pressure from his career grew larger. The gaps did not appear immediately. There was no specific moment that marked the change, but they formed slowly, little by little, through missed appointments, through shortened conversations, through the moments when both realized they were living the same life, but were no longer truly walking together as before. Jacqueline Ray had been by his side in the years when he had nothing, when the acting dream was still something distant, and precisely because of that, when success came, it should have been the time when they could enjoy the fruits together. But reality went in a different direction, when his work not only took time, but also took energy, leaving him without enough strength to maintain the necessary balance in family life. There were times he recognized the change, recognized that the distance between them was growing, but each time like that he was pulled back to work, to responsibility, to things he could not give up, and the delay in facing the problem made everything more difficult. Conversations gradually became fewer. Understanding gradually was replaced by silence, and in that silence both felt that something was being lost, but neither really knew how to keep it. When a relationship begins to lose connection, maintaining it is no longer just a matter of emotion, but becomes a challenge of time, of priorities. And in Tom Selleck's case, his priorities had been shaped by a career that he had spent too many years building. A career that he could not easily let go of, not only for himself, but also for all the people who depended on him. The decision to divorce did not come from an emotional explosion, but was the result of a long process where both realized that they could no longer continue as before, that what had once bound them was no longer strong enough to overcome the current pressures, and ending it, although painful, was the only choice left. When the marriage ended, it was not just a separation between two people, but also the end of a chapter in his life, a chapter that he had once believed would last longer. After everything settled down, what remained was not liberation, but a feeling of emptiness and regret, because he understood that not everything could be compensated by success, that there were things that once lost could not be taken back. And even though he could continue to move forward in his career, could continue to appear in public with the familiar image, inside he still carried thoughts about what had happened, about the choices that had been made, and about what could have been different if he had more time, if he could have balanced better. The mental pressure afterward did not disappear immediately, but followed him in the following years, like a reminder that every success comes with a price. And in his case, that price was not only physical fatigue, but also the losses in his personal life that no one could see from the outside. However, instead of letting those things pull him down, he continued to move forward, not because he did not feel the pain, but because he understood that stopping was not the way to solve it. And if he wanted to continue, he had to learn to carry everything that had happened without letting it stop him from moving ahead. After the losses left by his first marriage, Tom Selleck entered a stage where he was forced to look back at his entire life, not only his career, but also what truly mattered to him. And precisely in that period, he met Gilly Mack, a person who did not come from the noisy world of Hollywood in the way he had been familiar with. A person who brought him a feeling of stability, peace, and a chance to start again, not from the beginning, but from what he had learned after all the upheavals he had gone through. This relationship was not built under stage lights or under media attention, but in quietness, step by step, as if both understood that to keep something lasting, they needed to stay away from the pressures that had once broken what he had before. And precisely that difference made Tom Selleck begin to think seriously about changing the direction of his life. When his career was at its peak, when his name was still tied to great success and opportunities kept appearing. He stood before a choice that not many people in that situation were willing to make. That was to step back, not because he no longer had the ability, but because he understood that if he continued on the old path with the same intensity, he might lose what he truly wanted to keep this time. That decision did not come easily because it meant turning down big roles, turning down projects that could bring more fame and money, turning down opportunities that in the past he had spent many years to get, and that went against everything this industry usually encouraged, where people are taught to seize every opportunity when it appears. But for him, this time, keeping a stable life, a family with real presence, was more important than continuing to expand his career. He gradually moved away from the spotlight, no longer appearing as frequently as before, no longer the familiar face in every big project, and over time, media attention also decreased. Mentions of his name no longer appeared as often as before, and for many people that could be seen as a decline. But for him, it was the result of a choice he had considered very carefully. However, moving away from the spotlight did not mean everything became easier, because fame was not only something that brought opportunities, but also something that created a position where, when leaving it, a person had to face a significant void, a feeling he had to learn to adapt to, when from someone who was always noticed, he became someone living in greater quietness. When from someone who always had a packed schedule, he had to learn to live with periods of time not filled by work. There were times he realized that change more clearly than ever, when he was no longer called for roles that in the past might have belonged to him, when he saw new faces replacing the position he once held. And even though he had chosen this path, that feeling was still not completely easy to accept, because it reminded him that every choice comes with a sacrifice, and there is no path that keeps everything. But what kept him going was the belief that what he was building this time had longer-lasting value, that being present in his family's life, being able to spend time with the important people, was something he did not want to lose again. His will in this stage was no longer the will to prove himself like before, but the will to hold firmly to what he had chosen, even if that meant slowing down, meant no longer standing at the center of the entertainment industry, meant accepting that his name would no longer be mentioned with the same frequency as before. It was a difficult path in a different way, not because of a lack of opportunities, but because of having to refuse them. Not because of lacking ability, but because of choosing not to use all that ability for his career. And in a world where success is often measured by continuous presence, stepping back one step required great certainty about what one truly wanted. And in the silence of those years, when the lights no longer shone as before, Tom Selleck had built something that could not be measured by awards or fame. That was a life he could control, a life where he no longer had to trade everything to keep it. And even though that path did not bring immediate recognition, it gave him something he had not truly had before. That was complete presence in his own life. Moving away from the hectic pace of Hollywood, Tom Selleck moved to a large ranch in California, where there were no stage lights, no cameras following every step, only the quiet of nature and the simple tasks repeated every day. And precisely there, he began to rebuild his life in a completely different way, no longer relying on fame or recognition, but on concrete, real things that demanded true presence. The mornings no longer began with filming schedules or meetings, but with going out to check the land, taking care of crops, following the seasons, tasks that seemed simple but required patience, attention, and a spirit of discipline no less than what he had experienced in his acting career. From someone used to standing in front of the camera, he became someone who worked with his hands, with his own strength, and in that change, he did not seek ease, but accepted new difficulties, challenges that came not from external pressure, but from the demands of the life he had chosen. Adapting to a life separated from Hollywood was not a process that happened immediately, because even though he had decided to step away from the spotlight, The old habits and old rhythms were still there, and in the early days, the silence could become heavier than he thought, when there were no more continuous calls, no more urgent demands, no more feeling of always having to be in a state of readiness. He had to learn to slow down, learn to fill time with things unrelated to the work he had been familiar with for many years. There were moments when he realized that not being followed by anyone, not being demanded by anyone, was a challenge in a different way, because it forced him to face himself, to face thoughts that before could have been covered up by work and busyness. In this new life, discipline and responsibility did not disappear, but only changed form, no longer being about having to be on set on time, but about ensuring daily tasks were completed, from the smallest things like taking care of crops, maintaining the ranch, to maintaining a stable lifestyle that did not depend on external pressure. The values he learned from his family, from the difficult years before, now became the foundation that helped him maintain this life, helped him not get caught up in laziness or lose direction when there were no longer clear pressures like before. Each passing day was no longer measured by the number of scenes shot or contracts signed, but by the tasks completed, by the stability he gradually built. And in the repetition of those tasks, he began to find a new rhythm. A rhythm that was not too fast, not too slow, but enough for him to feel that he was truly living, not just running after an endless chain of demands. After the stressful years, when everything had to be completed in the shortest time, when every mistake could be magnified in front of the public, life on the ranch brought him a space to rebalance, not by completely avoiding work, but by placing it in a different position in his life, no longer the center, but a part of the whole. He did not completely abandon his career, but he no longer let it dominate his entire life like before. And precisely that change helped him maintain the stability he had been seeking, a stability that did not come from achieving more, but from knowing when to stop at the right time. In the quiet afternoons, when the sunlight gradually faded over the fields, when there was no longer the noise of cameras or calls, he could look back at his journey, not with regret, but with an acceptance that every stage had its role, that what he had been through, whether difficult or successful, had all led him to this place, a place without glamour, but with the peace he had spent many years trying to find again, in the quietness he gradually built on the ranch. Tom Selleck not only found ways to balance his life, but also faced another role even heavier than any role he had ever taken. That was the role of a father, a responsibility with no script, no director, and no chance to redo if mistakes were made. With Kevin, the son he adopted in his first marriage, the relationship between them was not always easy, especially when Kevin faced personal difficulties during his growing up, problems that no father wants to see in his child. And for Tom Selleck, that was not only worry, but also a deep pressure, because he could not help but wonder whether what had happened in the past, the years he was too busy with work, had affected his son in what way. When Kevin encountered challenges, he did not stand aside, but tried to support, tried to be present, tried to do the things he might not have done enough before, not with the certainty that he would solve every problem, but with the hope that his presence could make a difference, no matter how small. For Hannah, his biological daughter, the way he approached was different in tone, not because the love was different, but because he understood more clearly than ever the pressures that the outside world could bring, especially when growing up in the family of a famous person. He tried to create an environment where Hannah could develop as a normal person, away from unnecessary media attention, not letting his fame shape her life. And to do that, he had to keep a certain distance from the spotlight, had to turn down opportunities that could bring his family back to the center of attention. Decisions that were not always easy when he clearly understood the value of the career he had built. But for him, protecting his daughter from the pressures he had once experienced became a priority, a goal he was willing to trade many other things to achieve. The role of being a father was not only about protecting, but also about facing the fears he carried from the past. The fear that he might repeat the mistakes that had happened, the fear that even though he had tried to change, he might still not be enough. And precisely those thoughts made him have to try harder, to be present more, to listen more, even when that required him to step out of his comfort zone. There were times he realized that there was no formula for becoming a good father, that every decision carried risk, and that the only thing he could do was to keep trying, to keep learning, just like the way he had done in his career. Only this time, the result was not measured by awards or recognition, but by the stability and happiness of the people he loved. In those years, keeping the family stable became a task that required persistence no less than any challenge he had ever faced, because life did not always go according to plan. Difficulties still appeared, challenges still came, and each time like that, he had to stand firm, not as an actor, but as a father, a husband, a person responsible for what was happening under his roof. He could not control everything, but he could control how he reacted, how he was present, and how he continued, even when things were not easy. Gradually, in the repetition of ordinary days, in the quiet but continuous efforts, he built a foundation that he had not had before. A family that was not perfect, but strong enough to stand firm against challenges. A place where he did not need to play a role, did not need to maintain an image, but could be himself, with everything he had been through. And even though this path did not bring attention or recognition like his career, it brought a feeling he had been seeking for many years. That was the feeling that what he was doing truly mattered, not only to himself but to the people he loved most. After the years spent mostly on family and the life separated from the harsh pace of the entertainment industry, Tom Selleck once again returned to work, but this time not as the man who had once thrown himself into every opportunity with the same energy as before, but as a person who had gone through many upheavals, many choices, and understood his own limits more clearly. The role of Frank Reagan in Blue Bloods was not only a career opportunity, but also a new challenge, where he had to prove that he could still stand firm in an industry that had changed a lot since the days he was at his peak. When he first stepped onto the set for this project, he was no longer the man from the years before. His body no longer reacted as quickly as before. His endurance no longer allowed him to work with the same intensity, and the signs of age began to show clearly in every movement, every step, every look. But instead of letting those things become barriers, he accepted them as part of the reality he had to face. Working under physical conditions that were no longer as before required him to change his approach, no longer relying completely on strength or endurance, but relying more on experience, on understanding of the character, on the ability to control emotions and convey content that he had accumulated over many years. Each scene was no longer just about following the script, but a combination of what he had learned and what his body allowed, and precisely in that adjustment, he found a new way of working, slower, more careful, but still maintaining the precision and depth that audiences expected. Even so, maintaining a professional image in front of the public remained an unchanged requirement. He still had to show up on time, still had to complete the work with high quality, still had to keep the demeanor that people had become familiar with. And that required no small effort. When his body and spirit were no longer in their best state, there were days he stepped onto the set with a feeling of fatigue, with pains that before he could have ignored, but now became clearer. But he did not let that affect the work, did not let it become a reason to reduce responsibility, because he understood that the position he was holding was not only the result of the past, but also depended on what he was doing in the present. And if he wanted to continue, he had to maintain the standard he had set for himself from the very first days. Professionalism was no longer a choice, but a principle, something he could not give up, even when that required him to put in more effort than before. In that process, he also had to accept that his role had changed. No longer the center of every story, no longer the one leading the way he once did, but becoming a part of a collective. a person who brought stability and depth to the entire story, and accepting that was not always easy, especially for someone who had once stood at the highest position. But precisely that acceptance helped him adapt, helped him find new meaning in the work, not about proving he was still the best, but about contributing in the way that best suited the current situation. Even though he had passed his peak period, he still maintained his position in the industry, not by competing directly with new faces, but by maintaining stability, reliability, and commitment to the work, things that not everyone could do for such a long time. Audiences no longer saw him just as an actor, but as a familiar part, a presence they could trust, and precisely that helped him continue to be accepted, continue to be respected, even when time had changed many things around him. And in his return journey, there was no explosion or sudden advances, only continuation, day by day, scene by scene, role by role, as a way for him to prove that even though he was no longer like before, he could still stand firm, could still work, and could still keep what had brought him here. But as time continued to pass, what Tom Selleck could control with his will gradually had to face a reality that no one could avoid. That was the decline of the body after many years of continuous work. The initial signs were only light, fleeting pains, feelings of fatigue after a long day, but over time, they no longer disappeared quickly like before, but stayed longer, more clearly, like reminders that the body had carried too much throughout a journey spanning decades. Movements that were once very natural now slowed down. Scenes that seemed simple also required more effort, and mornings no longer began gently, but often came with stiffness, with lingering dull pains from the night before, making every step require some time for the body to adjust. The impact of many years of non-stop work began to show clearly in every small detail, from the way he moved on set, the way he stood in long scenes, to the way he had to adjust his work pace to match his current ability. No more days of working continuously without feeling tired. No more quick recovery after long shooting hours. Instead, a slower process that required patience and acceptance. Maintaining performance in that situation became a real challenge, not because he lacked experience or skill, but because his body no longer responded in the way he had been familiar with for many years, and that forced him to change, not to become weaker, but to find a way to continue within the new limits. There were moments he realized that if he continued working the old way, his body would not be able to keep up, and that put him in a difficult situation, having to choose between reducing intensity or continuing as before. And for him, stopping was not something easy to accept, because work was not just a part of life, but something that had shaped who he was for many years. Therefore, instead of stopping, he chose to adjust, to work smarter, to use experience to compensate for physical limitations, to focus on what he could control, and to accept that not everything could be done the old way. Even so, continuing to work when the body was no longer in its best state was not always easy. There were days he had to face pains that no one but him could feel, pains not big enough to force him to stop, but enough to make everything more difficult, from remembering lines, maintaining focus, to completing a scene that before might not have required much thought. But he did not let those things become reasons to give up, did not let them define his ability, but continued to move forward, step by step, in the way he had done throughout his journey. His will in this stage was no longer about surpassing others, no longer about reaching higher positions, but about overcoming his own limits. Each day, each scene, each completed task was proof of the persistence he had built from the very first years, when there was no guarantee that effort would bring results. And even though his body no longer allowed him to do everything like before, that spirit remained unchanged. Still, the thing that kept him standing firm, helped him continue working, continue contributing, and continue finishing what he had started. In an industry where youth and strength are often seen as advantages, maintaining a position when those factors gradually decline is no small challenge. But for Tom Selleck, that was not something that made him stop, but something that made him adapt, that made him find another way to continue. And precisely in that process, he proved that a person's value lies not only in what the body can do, but also in what they are willing to endure to keep going, even when things are no longer as easy as before. When the body had spoken in a way that could not be ignored, Tom Selleck gradually entered a stage that the outside world rarely saw. No more frequent appearances, no more continuous images on the media, but instead a quiet life kept behind the doors of the ranch, where he was no longer a name that had to be mentioned every day, but just a man living at his own rhythm. These years did not bring attention. There were no big headlines, but they were the period when he devoted most of his energy to closer things, to family, to himself, to tasks that no one needed to witness but still needed to be completed with the same seriousness he had once given to his career. He did not completely disappear, but his presence became more selective, less frequent. And that was not a sign of letting go, but the result of a conscious decision, a decision to rearrange the priorities in his life. In this life, time was no longer divided into small pieces by packed schedules, but stretched out in a way that allowed him to truly be present, without rushing, without being pushed, but able to devote himself fully to the people and things he valued. Mornings began more slowly, afternoons lasted longer, and evenings were no longer cut short by work, all creating a rhythm of life that he had never had the chance to experience before. Family became the center, not as a part in the list of things to balance, but as the place where he truly focused, where he could spend time, listen, and be present in the way that work before had not allowed. The small moments, the simple conversations, the days with nothing special became more meaningful because they were not interrupted, not replaced by external demands. Along with that, social activities and media appearances also gradually decreased, not because he was no longer invited, but because he no longer felt the need to appear everywhere, no longer felt the need to maintain continuous presence to hold his position. Because after everything he had been through, he understood that fame was not the only thing that defined who he was. Events, meetings, opportunities to appear in public were gradually chosen more carefully, and in many cases he chose not to participate, not because of a lack of opportunities, but because he had had enough, and keeping time for more important things became a clear priority. In that stillness, he began to focus more on personal values, things that did not depend on external recognition, did not depend on the number of viewers or media attention, but came from the feeling of satisfaction with what he was doing, from maintaining a stable life, from continuing to fulfill the responsibilities he had chosen. He no longer needed to prove anything, no longer needed to chase the standards of the entertainment industry, but only needed to hold firmly to what he believed was right, the things that had helped him get through all the previous stages. And in that process, he did not become passive, but continued to maintain a disciplined lifestyle, an organized routine of work and daily living, because he understood that stability does not come naturally. It needs to be maintained every day, through small choices, through repeated actions. These quiet years were not an end, but another stage of the journey, where he no longer had to face the pressures like before, but still had to confront himself, time, and the changes that life brought. And in that silence, there was no glamour, no great recognition, but there was a different kind of endurance, a continuation no longer based on ambition, but based on awareness of what truly mattered. And precisely that helped him maintain the stability he had spent many years searching for. From those quiet years, when Tom Selleck no longer appeared as frequently as before, the value of what he had done throughout his career became even clearer, not through headlines or immediate attention, but through the way the public continued to mention him, through the way his roles were still watched, and through the influence he left in the American television and film industry. In an era where the image of a man on screen kept changing, he had built a figure of stability, a steadfast, responsible, and reliable man, not only in the way he portrayed characters, but also in the way he approached work, an image not based on showiness or temporary attention-grabbing elements, but based on the consistency and depth he maintained through each role. His contributions did not lie in the largest number of roles or the most famous projects, but in the ability to create a standard that audiences could recognize immediately, a standard of professionalism, of character building, and of maintaining identity in an ever-changing industry. Through Magnum P.I., he brought an iconic image, a character that not only succeeded at that time, but also lived long in the memory of viewers, a role that helped shape how American television built central characters, combining strength, intelligence, and approachability. And when continuing with Blue Bloods, he once again proved that his presence was not only suitable for one period, but could adapt and be maintained across many different stages, bringing a more mature, deeper image that reflected what he had accumulated over time. These roles not only helped him sustain his career, but also created a broad influence, when many different generations of audiences could find a part of themselves in the characters he portrayed, from those who had followed him from the early days to new viewers who approached him through later projects. That influence did not stop at the audience, but also spread within the industry itself where he was a part, where colleagues looked at him not only as a successful actor, but as someone who had maintained stability and respect in an environment that was not easy to do so. The respect he received did not come from temporary successes, but from the way he worked, from the commitment he showed in each project, and from the fact that he did not trade personal values to achieve quick success. In an industry where many people had to change to survive, his ability to keep his own path, even when it was not always easy, became a difference that made him recognized in a special way. The achievements he gained after many years of dedication were not only measured by awards or titles, even though he had received important recognitions throughout his career, but also shown through the way the public continued to remember him, through the way his name remained associated with high standards in acting, and through the fact that what he had done still held value, even when he was no longer at the center of attention. There are careers remembered for explosive moments, and there are careers remembered for endurance. And in Tom Selleck's case, precisely that endurance created a legacy that was not easily faded, a legacy that belonged not only to what he had achieved, but also to the way he had achieved them, step by step, through time, through challenges, and through a steadfastness that not everyone could maintain in such a long journey. And when looking back at that entire journey, from the early days when no one knew him to becoming a name recognized across the United States, Tom Selleck does not appear as an easy or quick success story, but as a long chain of slow steps, difficult choices, and challenges stretched across many decades, where each stage demanded that he adapt, change, and continue, even when there was no guarantee that things would get better. From a boy who grew up with the feeling that he was not prominent enough, not talented enough to be noticed, he stepped into a harsh industry and had to face years of continuous rejection, where every opportunity was rare and every failure could make a person stop. But he did not do that, he continued. Not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he did not accept giving up before finishing the path. When the opportunity came with Magnum PI, he not only seized it, but also carried everything that came with it, from work pressure, media attention, to responsibility to the audience. And precisely in that stage, he achieved what he could only have imagined before, but at the same time began to face the trade-offs that not everyone could see. The difficult decisions he made afterward, from stepping away from the peak of his career, to focus on family, to accepting his own changes when returning with Blue Bloods, were not easy choices, because each decision came with a sacrifice, a giving up, and no choice kept everything. He had to face losing opportunities, no longer being in the position he once held, his body no longer responding as before, and family pressures that he could not solve with will alone. But in all of that, there was one thing that did not change. That was the persistence he had built from the very first days. A persistence that did not depend on circumstances, did not depend on results, but existed as a part of who he was. That will did not always show through big actions, but often appeared in daily choices, in continuing to work when the body was tired, in being present when family needed, in holding firmly to the values he believed in even when they did not bring immediate benefits. And precisely those small things, repeated over time, created a life not built on explosive moments, but on lasting endurance. He did not go fast, did not take the easiest path, but he did not stop, and precisely that brought him to the position he has today, a position not only measured by success, but by the way he achieved it. Tom Selleck's life is not a perfect story, not a journey without mistakes or losses, but a real journey, where every step carried its own difficulties, where each stage had challenges he had to overcome, and where nothing came easily, but precisely because of that, what he achieved carried a different meaning, not only the result of talent, but the result of persistence, of responsibility, and of not giving up, even when the road ahead was not clear. And when looking at that journey, what remains is not only the roles, the awards, or the fame, but the image of a person who kept going, step by step, through everything life put in front of him, and built a life where endurance became the foundation for everything else. Looking back at Tom Selleck's entire journey, what makes people not only impressed but truly heartbroken is the way one person had to go through so many years without being seen. From the boy who grew up with the feeling of not enough, to the man who was rejected again and again in auditions, and then when he finally achieved success with Magnum P.I, he had to pay the price with his own personal life, when his marriage to Jacqueline Ray could not survive under the pressure of work. Details like him working on an exhausting schedule, or having to stand in front of the camera when his body had begun to ache in his later years and blue bloods, clearly show that the success the public sees has never been free. Especially, the decision to withdraw from the peak to live on the ranch in California, refusing big opportunities just to keep his family, is the clearest proof that he did not choose the easy path, but chose the path true to his values, even if it meant trading fame. What is worth appreciating here is not that he became an icon, but that he kept himself throughout that journey, not letting pressure, money, or recognition change the core things. For American audiences, this story reflects a very familiar truth in real life. Career success often comes with personal sacrifices, and achieving more does not always mean living better. The biggest lesson from his life does not lie in pursuing fame, but in knowing when to stop at the right time, knowing what is truly important to choose, and having enough will to continue even when those choices make the path more difficult. If the story of Tom Selleck makes you think about the silent trade-offs behind success, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying meaningful journeys like this one. Thank you for following until the end, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue to explore lives that have stood firm despite going through so many challenges.